Hey friends, here we are. Next on our tarot tour through modern life, we are going to talk about the Empress.
Huzzah!
Now, I should preface this by saying that I have seen some conversations happening on social media and YouTube about this card, and I think that's good, although I haven't watched them yet because I've been overwhelmed by life. Last week, if you watched, we talked about the High Priestess, and I prefaced that card by talking about how gender and misogyny and patriarchy were going to influence the conversation there. It's going to happen again this week. It's going to happen again next week, because we're talking about really the four cards, the High Priestess, the Empress, the Emperor, and the Hierophant, that have the most tendency toward discussions of patriarchy and misogyny, hierarchy. Did I say hierarchy? Hierarchy. If I didn't say hierarchy, and the like. And I think they're going to influence the way that we see the cards today, but also help us understand the ways those things are activated in the life we live. I don't think that history has served the Empress particularly well in tarot. And I feel compelled, as I always do, to say, look, you don't have to give up anything you have with your relationship to the card as it is today. Anything I'm going to say is things that I've learned, things that I've come to understand through my own experience with them, and I'm hoping that it's going to challenge you to explore the card through a modern lens, through a modern day life. But you don't have to give up any of that stuff. But I do think that to reduce the Empress to purely a card about fertility and fecundity and even motherhood is somewhat misogynistic. That's not to say there's anything wrong with fertility, creativity, and motherhood. All of those things are wonderful. Literally none of us would be here without those things. So I'm not saying that to dismiss those ideas, only to say that there's more to the card than simply that. But it's what most people distill when they think about the Empress. It's what most of us think of when we pull that card. And as the series does, it's meant to pull back the curtain and explore with more nuance and more depth the way that this card can behave in the life we're living today. So that's what we're going to do. Now, it's true historically that queens, empresses, consorts, princesses, whatever title they were given, had the one responsibility in some cases of producing an heir. But that's not the case all the time, and history has plenty of examples where the Empress is more than that. And that's what I want to explore first, the realm in which the Empress served as head of state, because that's something, of course, that is real and true too. I guess the point is that the Empress can be more than a royal uterus, as my friend Liz and I often talk about. And when an empress or any queen, and by the way, this impacts how I think about the queens in tarot too, and maybe I'll do a video about the courts at some point using this technique. But the empress as head of state, similar to the queens as head of state, as monarch, exists under a very different set of conditions than an emperor or a king does. If you think about the way that historical monarchies worked, the first son or male heir inherited the title. Women generally only got the title if someone died, or they were the only heir, or there was some kind of war or a coup or something like that. This means that empresses were not trained up, or queens were not trained up in the same way that their male counterparts would have been in order to be the leader of a nation state. They were trained to be agreeable spouses ready to produce an heir. And what this means is that when an empress became queen, when an empress became the head of state, that meant that she had a whole lot of obstacles that she had to face that kings don't. And so when we think about the queen or the empress as the leader, we have to think about the way they had to maneuver that job in a patriarchal society that didn't value them up until the moment it was forced to because of the death of a man. In many ways, the empress would have the deck stacked against her and still have to do the job. And can you draw any lines between that and modern life? I think you can, and we'll probably point some out here. The empress would have to be super aware all the time. She'd have to know what was going on when and with who. She'd have to know who was really supporting her, who was plotting against her, what things might be going on behind the scenes. She had to have her intuition working all the time, because there were plenty of opportunities for the men in her council to throw her under the bus. Not that they had buses back then. That meant that she had to deal with the misogynistic patriarchal attitudes of those counselors. She had to be ready, willing, and able to change her tactics when she came up against a roadblock, usually a man who wasn't willing to trust or listen to her. When some sexist dickhead refused to acknowledge her power, She would have to engage another method. She might have to be coy, flirty, charming, conciliatory, flattering in order to get his attention or to get his approval or to get him even to listen to what she was saying. Again, can you see any parallels to that in modern life? She has to code switch. She has to do what it takes in order to get people to trust her and to make them feel like she can do the job. And to also make them feel like they're not the wrong ones for not trusting her. Oh, silly me, I'm so, oh, I'm so clumsy, what a poor little empress I am. Now fucking do what I told you. She has to think fast, she has to be intuitive, she has to be quick-witted, she has to know her stuff as much as she can, and she has to be able to battle the wits and attitudes and egos of the men she's dealing with. And she still has to produce an heir. All right? The Empress is so much more complex and powerful than the Emperor because of all of the things she has to face in order to get the same job done in addition to the job of an Empress. Do you know what I mean? And so it's a far more nuanced conversation than merely one side of the coin, creativity, fertility, whatever. Yes, all of that's there. How creative do you have to be in order to win over a council who doesn't trust you and an entire nation who is raised to believe that women don't have power? You're going to have to be creative. You're going to have to be clever. And all of these qualities are things you can find in this card. So where we associate that card with creativity, it doesn't just have to be the idea of fertility and giving life to something. It can be the idea of having to be clever and thoughtful and intuitive and instinctive about how to achieve an end, about how to get a result, about how to get where you're going. And then there's the matter of diplomacy, of having to make treaties and pacts with nations, getting them to trust you, mostly these other men who, again, were born and bred to believe that women were second-class citizens and did not belong in power. Every time we peel a layer back in the job of the Empress as a head of state, things get more complicated, more nuanced, and she has to get more precise, more creative, more adaptive, more flexible, more cunning in order to achieve her results. And all of that is in this card. And it all gets watered down when we reduce it to something so much simpler than that and so much more one-sided than that. Today, regardless of where we sit on the gender spectrum, these qualities exist in us because we all have situations where we're not the top dog, where we have to survive, whatever that means in whatever conditions or contexts we're talking about. So it can mean code switching. If you don't know that term, it's essentially having to adapt your behavior in order to fit the dominant behavior. So it's like a gay guy butching it up to fit in around a bunch of straight men. That's what code switching is. It's a thing that we have to do in order to survive in some cases. It's a common term in anti-racist work as well. So it can represent the act of having to do that, or someone who's in a position of having to do that. But it can also represent determination and the ability to think fast, on your feet, and achieve results when the obstacles in deck are stacked against you. It can suggest dominating in an environment where you're the minority, or where people don't believe that you have the skills to achieve what needs to be done. It can signal self-possession and the willingness to own yourself regardless of the circumstances. So there's a strength and a power, a depth to this card that I think gets left behind in a lot of old-fashioned ways of looking at the card. And of course it does. I mean, as we talk about time and time again, one of the reasons why these cards get interpreted this way is that wherever it came from, though, we were dealing with Abrahamic religious traditions that favored men. And so the Empress, the High Priestess, all of the more feminine cards have more stereotypically feminine interpretations based centuries ago. We don't have to stick with that. We can open it up and represent what we're seeing in modern life. And as I keep saying, that's the whole point of the series, to find the Empress in the world. If the Empress were a job today, how would she be able to engage the world? You can do this with every character card in the tarot. It doesn't have to just be the Empress. You can ask yourself, if this were a job today, who would be doing it? Why? What would it look like if someone else were doing it? What are the obstacles they face in order to get that job done? What are the techniques they would use to achieve their goal? You can even ask yourself these questions in the context of a reading and sort of tease out nuances that you never thought of before, given what you know about the question and the querent and the other cards on the table. All of these things can help you unlock new and interesting things about all of the cards. When I think of the Empress today, I think of Lizzo.
Baby, how you feeling?
She does not care what you think, and that is inspirational to me. She owns who she is, she loves who she is, and there's a generosity of spirit about that when she performs, when she talks, when she engages with social media. Whenever I think of Lizzo, I think of the Empress and tarot.
I'm 100% that bitch.
But it can be anybody that you admire in a way that is free and owning themselves and self-possessed and like totally into who they are. I think that the Empress gets to be all of that too. Because we looked at the Empress through a historical lens, there are different constraints now, there are different experiences and existences, but like to me Lizzo is that example of like just being a badass who does not give a fuck. And to me, there's all of that in the Empress too. And so the Empress in a reading can also represent times when you need to embody that quality, that self-possession, that surety, that self-confidence, that willingness to walk in a room of people who are saying, no, you're not the right size and shape for a pop star, or no, you're not the right person for this job, you're not the right gender, race, whatever for this role. Owning yourself and being self-possessed enough to walk in the room in any way and say, yes, I damn well am. I think that's a quality of the card too. Again, much more deeper and nuanced than the creative fertility stuff. And again, I'm not shitting on that. It's useful. I'll talk about some examples of why later. But the point is, you can see so much when you start digging that it's like, why just settle for what we've been told? Why not try to dig deeper in a reading, in our own thinking about the card, in the context of a question, in order to find really powerful, useful, crisp, precise answers to our questions? That's just like, oh my God. Once you start doing that, it's like, well, you start just seeing everything in a whole new way. It really frees you. It really, really does. Promise. So, the Empress can represent fertility and creativity and all of that, and that's fine too. The Empress is definitely a card you want to see in a situation where you're starting a new project. And looking at other cards in the reading can kind of tell you how the Empress is behaving, or whether or not she's behaving in that sort of nurturing, creative, fertile way. If there's a lot of aces in a spread, or a lot of early number cards, aces, twos, threes, then the Empress is a great shepherd to help bring them to fruition. If there's a lot of tens in a spread, you can think of tens as fruition. And so you can see with tens and maybe higher cards, the Empress achieving that result or helping to get that result achieved. Do you know what I mean? And so like in that case, you can see how the Empress sort of nurtures a project all the way through. How it gets care and feeding at the beginning, and then it's nourished and cared for all the way through to fruition. And if you're working with like Rider-Waite-Smith cards, then cards like the Seven of Pentacles, the Nine of Pentacles, those could really amp up those qualities as well. But see how it's all about context, you know what I mean? It's all about what else is in the spread, what the question is, and who we're dealing with, you know what I mean? If someone says to you, I really want to be CEO of my company, and the Empress comes up, yeah, maybe like nurturing your career is the good way to go. But I think what the card is probably more likely to be saying is you got to own yourself. You got to walk into that room and say, I am the right person for the job. I'm the Empress. I'm Lizzo. Hire me right now. Not in a cocky way, but in a confident way, in a way that is self-possessed. So we're always looking to the cards, we're always looking to the question, and we're always looking to the context in order to figure out which version of this card we're dealing with. Who is the Empress playing today? What qualities is she exhibiting? All of that's in the nuances of the reading. So I might get comments about like how I'm talking about the Empress in this way and how I keep talking about the gender relationships, the gender roles in the tarot. And I really want to reiterate that I don't read the cards gendered, but what we can understand about the character of the card comes from things we know about the world and how people act and what happens to us and the roadblocks we face. In this example, you know, this Queen Elizabeth I kind of standing up to the men and claiming your role is a metaphor for things that happen in life. It's a metaphor for things that we go through. It could just be being brave enough to go order a new coffee drink that you've been kind of embarrassed to order. You know what I mean? Like, in my book, I talk about size and scope, right? So it's not always going to be like your Queen Elizabeth I taking on the council. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's like having the gravitas or the self-possession to go do the thing you're nervous about doing, or being confident in the interview, or any number of things, right? The point is that these stories, whatever we use, need to be translated from the literal into the metaphorical, or rather from the metaphorical into the literal. Like, all of the major arcana cards have these archetypes, and that's a word I think not a lot of people really understand when they use. But what I think of it as is that you take the empressishness, the story of the Empress, and then you apply it to a life situation. And so you've got all these qualities, all this story of the empress-ishness of the card, all these obstacles, all these techniques, all these tactics that she would use, and then you translate that into the life of the person that you're reading for and the situation. So again, maybe it's about going to order coffee. Maybe it's about going to ask someone on a date. But whatever it is, you take the metaphor and you translate it into something real, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, let me know and I can talk some more about it. And as always, think about partnerships. What is the Empress doing when paired with the Emperor, or with the Hierophant, or with the Tower, or with the Lovers, or with Death? How do those pairings change the Empress? How do they change what tactics they might be demonstrating, what qualities they might be activating? And that's for good and bad. I've been pretty positive about the Empress too, but we have to twist it on its head and also remember that these have to be pretty neutral in order to think about times where we may not be behaving in the right way, or where someone may be demonstrating less than optimal behavior. And again, other cards can help us do that. And so the challenge for you too is, like, I've talked about the Empress as like a really diplomatic, thoughtful, intuitive, quick-witted, smart person who's capable of overcoming a lot of obstacles in addition to all the things we already know about. Like, what are some of the downsides of that? You know, maybe this person is really suspicious because they think everyone's out to get them. Maybe they can be too manipulative because they're always thinking they have to win people over. You know, it's interesting to think about those aspects too, and you can and should do that. And again, context will tell you sort of where the Empress is exhibiting those qualities too. All of the cards. It's all the same story. And as I keep saying, like, what these video essays are really meant to do is sort of inspire you to do the same. As always, you may not agree with anything I've said here, but the idea is to challenge you to think about the card with more nuance, with more connection to the world we're living in and the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is what most readings are about. Where's the Empress in the world for you? What does the card look like? What do they do? How do they behave? What historical things have you learned about heads of state that make sense today that you can use in readings? Where can you translate the metaphor of those stories into modern life, into the things we deal with on a day-to-day basis? And also, when is the Empress the version that we always learn? The creativity, the fertility, the fecundity, the nurturing. When is that part of the puzzle? Think about those things as we get ready for next week, when we're going to talk about the Emperor, who in many ways is the complete opposite of this. So stay tuned, be good, we'll talk soon, take care.
I'ma hit you back in a minute.